everybody, so today we're going to be talking about the working memory model, a little aside as well to do with case studies, so obviously that is supporting your research methods knowledge. So we're talking about a different model today. It's one of the key models that you need to know for your memory topic, so please pay attention. And you may also want to have the diagrams beside you again, just to reinforce and to ensure that you understand the different components and what is being asked of you for the specification. So what is it? Well, it's an alternative to the multi-store model of memory, and it is very specific in that it talks mainly about the short-term memory. Badley and Hitch felt that the multi-store model of memory was far too simplistic in explaining how memory worked, and they felt that actually short-term memory is made up of lots of different parts rather than just one. So they thought that if you process visual and auditory information, you can accomplish that without interference. But if you're trying to process two types of visual information, then these can be performed poorly. And they were interested in the fact that we seem to be able to do two things at once, and for us to be able to do that, there had to be some separation in the short-term memory. So they developed that model on the back of that. So here it is. It looks a little bit more complicated than the multi-store model of memory, but don't be afraid because we're going to work through it. So 1974, quite a long time ago now compared to where we are in history, but this is still quite modern in terms of cognitive psychology. So as you'll note, there are 4 different components to it in terms of the short term, 5 if you include the long term. So the main thing you kind of need to be aware of in terms of this kind of looming ominous bit here is that the central executive is the one in charge. It is the big boss. So it controls the slave systems, and that is actually officially their name. These are the slave systems. And it controls the attention and how much we do within these. So we've got a phonological loop there, which controls auditory information, visuospatial sketchpad, which is to do with visual, and the episodic buffer, which is either a combination or neither of those. And episodic buffer will actually be a criticism of this model later on because it wasn't added until a little bit later on. So that can be a criticism of this model as well. Other thing you need to know is that there are 2 directional arrows for each of these components. So unlike the multi-store model of memory where it was one direction and that is the way you go, with this model it is a lot more interactive, it's a lot more active as a model, and you can bounce between them. So you can go from central executive to episodic buffer, to long term, to back to episodic buffer, to central executive, to visuospatial sketchpad, etc, etc, etc. So it's a lot more interactive as a model in that respect. So it might be worth taking a little note, copying this diagram down, because I have seen questions where they ask you to label it properly. So components of the working memory then. I've already kind of pointed them out in a very brief way, so this is just going into a little bit more detail. So central executive, it is the one that directs the attention, the executive is the one in charge, therefore you can kind of remember in that respect. So it controls all the other systems by determining how will we use our resources today. So it could be a control tower at an airport if you wanted a more real life example to put it against. Phonological loop, technically this is actually divided into 2 parts. So we have the phonological store, which is the inner ear, and the articulatory process, which is the inner voice. So easiest way I can think of to describe the articulatory process would be like that voice you hear when you're reading, and inner ear is that kind of like that processing, you hear it echoing in your head. So that is all to do with what we hear. Visuospatial sketchpad, it controls visual and spatial information. So when you're driving, when you're parking the car, that is what you're using. So how things look and where they are in relation to you, in relation to other things, etc, etc. And the episodic buffer is a more general store added to account for things that are both visual and acoustic or neither. So same again, central executive, and it's just kind of going into a little bit more detail than the previous slide. So slave resources that it can control are the phonological loop, visuospatial sketchpad, and the episodic buffer. Where does this data come from? Well, it comes from the senses or it comes from the long-term memory, but the central executive itself has a very limited capacity and it cannot store data. Central executive is also a criticism of this model because we don't really know what it does fully. So it doesn't really have this role explained very well, and that can be a criticism of this model, as we'll have a look at later. Phonological loop, so it is the two different parts, the inner ear and the inner voice, the phonological store and the articulatory process, and it preserves the order of information as well. So that is when we go right, A, then B, then C, etc., etc. Phonological store holds the words that you hear, so that is that echo that I talked about earlier. An articulatory process is about words that are heard or seen, so words that are repeated themselves, that you listening, hearing a voice when you read, etc. And it's thought that these are a form of maintenance process. So visual spatial sketchpad, this is what you need when you're planning a driving route, when you plan a spatial task. So I could say, okay, picture your bedroom, and you would be able to navigate quite happily around that in your head. That is you using the visual spatial sketchpad. Visual information, obviously what things look like, and spatial is just the different physical relationship between things. You could arguably separate this into two more. This was the view taken by Logie in 1995, which is the visual cache, which is information about visual items. So a football is black and white, it's round, it's usually made of leather, etc., etc. And the inner scribe, so that's the arrangement of objects in the visual field. So how does my classroom look? How does your bedroom look, etc., etc. And the episodic buffer, so it was added quite late on, it was added in 2000, and it integrates all the different information that you get from all the different other slave systems and things. Apparently it also maintains time sequencing, and it records events that are happening, so it does account for all those other extra little niggly bits, which is good, but the fact it was added later and not thought of originally is also a negative. So what's good about it? Well, it explains dual task performance. It explains the ability of us to be able to watch something, listen to something, and process all that information at the same time. So Hitch and Badley did a study in 1976. And what they did is they gave participants either a task that occupied their central executive, or they gave them a task that occupied both their articulate, so their auditory loop, or their central executive and their auditory loop. So it showed that people were slower when they used both the articulatory loop and the central executive. So they were a little bit slow in that respect. You're using two different ones, does explain it, but it just takes a little bit longer. So also there is evidence from brain damage patients, which we can discuss in detail later on. Central executive, what is its actual role? Well, that is the big question. There's confusion as to what it actually does, whether there's one component, whether there's two. A case study by Islinger and Damasio in 1985, they had a look at someone called EVR, and they showed really good reasoning skills but poor decision making. So it suggests that his central executive wasn't quite intact, so it supports its existence, but it doesn't support that it's one store because it seemed to be made up of several different things. And there's evidence against these. So quick divergence then into case studies. What is a case study? Well, it's a detailed study of one individual or event. Looked at several of these so far, looked at HM, looked at Clive, and these can support or refute these models. So adding one more to your arsenal, and that is the case study of KF. So in the 1970s they were involved in a motorcycle accident, and this left him with damage to his left occipital lobe. His short-term memory was damaged, where he only ended up with a digit span of 1 as opposed to the norm, which is 7 plus or minus 2, but his long-term memory seemed to be normal. The reason why it supports the working memory model though is that he remembers words much better if they are presented visually as opposed to auditorily, and so that seems to offer support for the working memory model. It can also support a multi-store model of memory though, so even though his long-term is intact, short-term isn't, supports multi-store, so that's really good, but he remembers words better if they're presented visually rather than auditorily, so that supports the working memory model. So what I would do is you'd grab your textbooks right now and you need to try and find a study to support the existence of all these different components of a working memory model. Really important to build up your A3, and it's also really important to build up your knowledge and awareness of studies that we do in psychology. So although there seems to be about 1 billion of them that you have to remember, it is still quite important to make sure that you have stuff to support your A3 and develop those evaluation points. Super important, okay? So have a little look in your textbook and see if you can find some of those. And when you've done that, again, here's some homework for you. So have a look at the questions, make sure you do the long question as well. Yes, I know it looks exactly the same as the multi-store model of memory one, but actually you'll find it says working memory model. So as ever, get in touch, get any questions that you have to me, and I'll see if I can help you out. So thank you for listening, and good luck with the work.